when Shemot began, last week or a week ago, there was something very important that happened. And that's that Moshe, the shepherd, takes a walk, is looking for a lost lamb, and all of a sudden he takes note of something, and the rabbis make kind of a big deal about the fact that he literally turns and pays attention. Something new and different occurred, and that's when he meets the burning bush. So one of the lessons we learn from that little piece is how important it is to constantly be open, aware. We never know when something new, something different, something special will catch our eye. And that's how hopefully we all go through life, with curiosity. So I know that you're used to, you've been together, I understand, quite a while. So I'm just kind of like this different personality who has now sort of been foisted upon you. I don't know if you know anything about me. My husband and I are both rabbis. We have a small community in Los Angeles called Neve Shalom, which we've had since the 90s. I also teach at the Academy for Jewish Religion, which is where I know Rabbi Susan Nanas, and we're colleagues, and she's brought me in to do various sundry things, including the adult B'nai Mitzvah. So I'll be starting with them on Wednesday. I'm an artist, so I'm going to bring some visuals, if that's okay with you, to highlight some of what we're talking about. The other piece for me, I am very into spiritual practice. Now, that doesn't mean you guys have to meditate. It's not what, that isn't probably something you're used to doing. But spiritual practice is about going into the depth of what we study, especially Torah, and finding the connections for ourselves personally. That's part of what I like to emphasize. So it may not be historical so much, but hopefully to make the Torah relevant in your lives. You know, the Torah is interesting. It has wonderful narratives. It has numbers of personalities, but we read the Torah on multiple levels, sometimes as metaphor, just sometimes as plain story. But I like to dig in and have us identify, if we can, and I'll focus on some words or some Hebrew or letters, as a way to dig in and hopefully dig into yourself. So it may be a different approach, but just take this as a month of newness, opportunity, whatever you can receive from me, I will be thrilled. I have some notes that I'm going to share. I'm going to show some visuals. And there's an article I'm also going to share because we're going to talk about the plagues. So I want to begin. I don't know how you usually start, but I am going to share a blessing. So let me just, let's go here for a moment, if you don't mind. And let me just make it bigger. So, as I said, as a Jewish artist, I am very into the stimulation of color and design. I'm also an interior designer, but Jewish art was kind of my life for many, many years, and I still do ritual objects. So this is an image of Parshat Bo, and it's in the context, obviously, of the splitting of the sea, which we will talk about next week. And the word bo means come. And a lot, the rabbis say, why doesn't it say go? Moses is being told by God, come to Pharaoh, instead of go to Pharaoh. Because we understand that God is present in that moment with Pharaoh in Egypt, and we're going to focus a lot on the heart because I'm going to read a little bit here when it talks about something occurring, and we know that God is very much involved in the heart. We all have hearts, and so we're going to make this somewhat personal as we move through this. What I want to do first, though, is do a blessing. I like to do a blessing for studying Torah, which you see at the top. You know, in this Zoom world, everybody stays muted because when we all talk together, it's like a balagan. It doesn't work well. But you are welcome to join me as we do this blessing that is an intention for what we're going to do. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So la'asok is the most amazing word because it has this onomatopoeia. It's about immersing yourself, but literally when we say to soak up something, we take it in fully. So the word la'asok, think about taking in fully these words of Torah. And we are in Mitzrayim. I'm sure that this is something you have been exposed to, and that's the Hebrew, right? So you were talking about how important it is to focus on the Hebrew. So Mitzrayim is the name for Egypt, but it has lots of meanings. It's a place of restriction. It is a place that is narrow, can bring on pain, somewhat limited. We know it's a place of enslavement, of being confined, held back, holding back, being prevented to move forward. But another way to look at the Hebrew is to read it mi tsar yam. And yam is a sea. So from a very restricted sea, from a troubled sea, that's what Egypt represented. I want to just review with you, since Bo, which is the portion we're on today, is going to look at the last 3 of the 10 plagues. But I just wanted to review with you and just look at a little different interpretation for moderns. And you know we do this in the Haggadah on Pesach, on Passover. So let's just take a quick review of what we're talking about. The last portion had the 7, and the first one, of course, is dam, which means blood. And the water is turned to be something rather uncomfortable. It didn't look good. It couldn't be used. It was pretty uncomfortable. But that leads to tzvardea, which are the frogs. And these are just interpretations of a modern way of understanding these plagues. So if you were sitting at a Seder table and you were reading them this year, you might say, we need to comfort and mourn those whose blood has been spilled. So we find kind of a modern application for this ancient and horrific experience of the Nile. The frogs, Svardea, so is interpreted maybe perhaps now as they proliferated Egypt to protest the proliferation of violence. We know that we live with much of that in this world. And then came kinim, the lice. And a way to look at that today is stop the infestation, because lice is an infestation. When my children were young, they went to Jewish camps and they always came back with head lice. But we look at it in modern times as an infestation of hatred and fear. Arov, wild animals. And we appeal to all the people to act with humanity, because there is much in the world which feels animalistic and not human. Dever is pestilence, and we could see that as overcoming the sickness of racism and bigotry. Shechin are boils. That is a very uncomfortable, unpleasant disease. And we tend to those who suffer from disease. So we apply it now in this world of all the multiple kinds of diseases that, affect us both emotionally and physically. Barad is hail. We respond to storms and disasters that claim our lives. So it's a way to modernize and psychologize and spiritualize what was a reality in Egypt, these horrific hard balls that were falling all over the city. And then in this portion, we meet Arbe, the locust. We fill the air with voices for change, because we want to get rid of those things that proliferate and eat up, the things that are important to us. And then we meet Choshech, darkness. And we want to bring light to those who live in the shadows, in the darkness. And that is something that in Judaism, is a very important value. And we learn through Isaiah that God, I'm just hitting people here, that God brings both good and evil in the world. That is something that Isaiah teaches. So there is darkness and there is light. It is our job to find that light, the goodness, and bring it into our lives and into the world. And then the last one, Makot Bechorot, death of the firstborn. So in a modern sense, we're looking at the next generation and how it can impact the world. So I'm just going to stop sharing, then we'll come back to some more images. I hope that's helpful to both use the senses of the eyes as well as the ears. So if you have your book, you know that we are in chapter 10 of Exodus. And let me repeat where I come from, and with this statement. The Torah is an opportunity through the stories, the personalities, the events, to teach us to look at ourselves and to see how we live out some of these teachings. Torah is an opportunity to expand our wisdom and our awareness so that we can become more refined, be better people, truer sense of oneself, and closer to the divine. So I see there's a couple of questions. I don't know who was first. Steve, would you like to?
This goes back to when you were giving us some literal translation of Mitzrayim,
Yes.
which seems very well suited to the Exodus story. But isn't Egypt also called Mitzrayim when Avram and Sarai journeyed there? And how does it relate in that sense?
Well, it is in Torah, when you see the word Mitzrayim, it's a reference to Egypt. That is the name for Egypt. I was breaking it down a little bit so that you could see that the key of the Hebrew is the two letters, the Tsadi and the Resh, Tsar. That's kind of the key of that Mitzrayim. Somebody very cleverly broke it into Tsar Yam, but the Tsar in the middle Tsar is trouble. Tsar is difficulty. And Egypt in Torah represents all of that. So whether you see it connected to Abraham or to Moshe, it is the name for that country that has this very deep-rooted meaning that it's up to no good. I hope that helps.
It
Eric.
does.
Yeah, good. Eric? Eric, you wanted to ask a question? Can you unmute?
Yeah, I'm okay. Got the word. The light is a sterilizing agent. When you use light in the biohood where I used to work, sterilize and clean the biohood, like the light of the Jewish people, like is not well welcomed in the evil of the society. So that's why I can perceive that the anti-Semitism comes from the disdain for light shining on the evilness of the world.
You know, that's our job, isn't it? We're called in Torah to be a light to the nations. You know, Judaism, from my point of view, is this unbelievably beautiful and phenomenal wisdom and richness. There are secrets that much of the world is not aware of. That is, you know, the essence of who we are. There is so much that we carry that brings light and goodness. So yes, that's who we are. We're ambassadors. I like to think of myself as an ambassador. Aside from being a rabbi and a cantor and a teacher and an artist, and I write in the Jewish Journal. There are multiple ways that I like to express whatever gifts I have received from God. But being an ambassador is so important to think of yourself that way when you come into the world and you meet others. That's what the ambassador does. It brings the goodness, right? And connects and creates wonderful relationships. We send ambassadors to foreign countries.
I agree with you, but I was listening to Thomas Sowell lecture on anti-Semitism. He only said one word. The only one that people would like us if we fail, but if we succeed, we are hated. So that's what Thomas Sowell said in one of his lectures on YouTube. Fascinating, isn't that?
It is.
Because we're very successful people in the world. Because we came to New York. New York with only clothes on the back, and look at the merchants stores we used to have, A&S and all that stuff. I'm from New York and I'm in Florida right now, and I enjoy the company.
Yes, there is some truth to that. The better we get, the more influence we have, the more likely that we will have enemies and people who want to squash us and silence us. There's no question that there is some truth to that, but we can't let that stop us, right? Even if people are not receptive. Yes?
Thank you. I hope I didn't monopolize too much because I'm on the spectrum, and once I get started on a special interest, I can't stop very easily.
That's okay. You're very excited, and but we do need to move on. And if anybody else has a question, please feel free. So let me start.
Ray has a question.
Oh yes, Ray. Sorry. Go ahead.
Thank you. I have a question about tsar.
Yes.
Which slight tangent, but it's a fast tangent. Is the shorus of tsar, does that lead to tsuris in Yiddish? There seems like a sympathy of meaning there.
Yes, absolutely. In Yiddish, we call it tsuris. Yes. Having grown up in Eastern European post-Holocaust and with Holocaust survivors, the word tsuris was expressed. Yes, there is a connection between the two. Absolutely. Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. And many of you, I don't know, are you familiar with Yiddish? I don't speak it very well, but there are a few words that stick, and tsuris is certainly one of them. There's this little statement, it's schwer to be a Yid. You know, it's hard to be a Jewish person. You know, that's a statement that comes from our Eastern European experience and being a Jew in the world. It's schwer to be a Yid. So we come to Bo, and let me just read a little bit of this and we'll talk about it. Hashem says to Moses, come to Pharaoh. So we talked about the word Bo. For I have made his heart and the heart of his servants stubborn, so that I can put these signs of mine in his midst, and so that you may relate in the ears of your son and your son's son that I made a mockery of Egypt, and my signs that I placed among them, that you may know that I am Hashem. So there is a lot of this throughout these the chapters of these two portions, talking about the hardening, the stiffening of the heart. The first 5 plagues, what the rabbis teach us is that Pharaoh has this habit of hardening his own heart. And generally what we mean by that, of course, is that he's pretty stubborn. But the other 5 of these plagues, God is hardening Pharaoh's heart. There's a shift here. It's almost as if by doing it as much as Pharaoh has, he's kind of locked himself in. He's locked himself into a position that he can't even get out of. So much of the decision-making that we make, all of us, is impacted by the heart. Now, we know everything goes on in the brain, but we think about the heart, the place of compassion, the place of stubbornness. We can transform ourselves when we focus of heart language and what that all means. So I want to look at some of the reasons why these plagues are so critical. And let me open it up to you for a moment. If I said to you, why are the plagues used by God to begin with? Why the plagues? If God is as powerful as God is, he could have turned Moses into a meaningless personality, and just take over. Let's just assume. But what we're talking about is this country, Mitzrayim, and this is God's approach to making this huge shift so that liberation will ultimately happen. If I asked you, does anybody have an idea, a response? Why the plagues? Why did God choose these 10 events and actions? Does anybody have an idea? Rebecca, looks like you have your hand up.
To influence not only the Israelites, but also the Egyptians, because they had multiple gods. God for this, God for that, a God for whatever. And so with each plague, I would think it would sort of represent perhaps one of their deities.
Oh, you are so smart. I feel like I plucked you in there to set me up. So I want to share something, because that is one of the reasons. There's no question that these hardships were important to break down the confidence, the stubbornness, the attitudes. And you're right, this was not just for the Israelites. It probably was more for the Egyptians than it was for the Israelites. However, they needed to see God in action as well, right? They needed to get yirah, which is sometimes called fear, but this awe of something that was happening that was beyond understanding. So let me share with you, because you went exactly where I wanted to go. That was perfect. So I want to share this because there are a lot of different places on the web where you can get this information. But one of the things I liked about this particular article is that the images are images of the gods that we're talking about. Yes, there were multiple gods. I mean, that was the biggest problem of all, right? The Israelites had lived in Egypt. They were exposed to this concept of multiple gods, often as statues. And God needed to break all that down. So let's look at some of these gods. Oops. I was at the end. Let's go here. One of the things that is important to point out, of course, that there are 10, and somehow this balancing factor between these 10 horrific events and then the number 10 for the 10 commandments, right? Just as the 10 commandments become symbolic of the fullness of moral law of God, the 10 ancient plagues of Egypt represent the fullness of God's expression of justice and judgment on those who God felt they needed to repent. I don't know if you read the notes from Wilshire last night and Rabbi Leader talking about humility, which was wonderful. So here you are, right? We're being reminded of this pride that Pharaoh had. He had no humility whatsoever. And we see that in some of our political leaders today. And being humble and seeing one's place in the larger picture is really important. So let's take a look here at these plagues, because I thought this was interesting given the images. So the first one is Hapi, and she is the Nile, right? And the Nile was very important. The water was necessary and it was needed. And so the very first plague God chose was to turn all this water into blood. And it was, I'm sure, unbelievably terrifying, not only for the Israelites, but for the Egyptians to see their God, their river, the place that had food that would take care of them, turned into red, must have been horrific. The next one, which is the frogs, is the god Heket, the Egyptian goddess of fertility and renewal. And in the image, this god has the face of the frog. So the connection here is obvious, right? And once the water was as disgusting as it forced these creatures out and onto the earth. So, historically, people find these connections that one obviously led to the other, that led to the other. But we're looking at it a little differently here. We're looking at what God chose as a way to break down the people and to break down Pharaoh and to let them know that multiple gods was not the way the people needed to follow. The Israelites needed to be broken. They needed to be shifted from this kind of lifestyle. So the third one is called Geb. And here's a picture. The god of the earth. And what do we have? Lice. And when they, they're really unpleasant little creatures and they're hard to get rid of. As I said, my kids brought them home. I even got them at one point. And there was this tiny, tiny fine comb that you used to kind of, scrape them out. There was washing the hair with this disgusting shampoo over and over and over again. So things are starting to get more unpleasant, but God is letting the Egyptians know, you know what? Your gods are not that powerful. Here's the fourth one, Khepri, the Egyptian god of creation. And what comes after all of the lice and the frogs? The flies. It probably feels like it makes a lot of sense. They show up, right, when these things kind of proliferate. If you put something in the garbage and you don't take care of it, eventually, you get those larvae and then you have flies. The next one, Hathor, the Egyptian goddess of love and protection. So now what do we have? The animals, they're dying. And, they depended on that for food. And so this became another plague. And this, as you can see, is the god. And then we have Isis, Egyptian goddess of medicine and peace. And then, of course, they're inflicted physically. The sixth plague was probably horrific. I don't know if any of you have had shingles. My husband had a horrific event 20 years ago. And the sores often looked almost like boils. They were, it's painful. And can you imagine all these people now not only losing the sources of what sustained them, but now physical pain? Nut, the Egyptian goddess of the sky, and then we get the hail. And it comes in fire, in flames. It's large, it's probably hard. And if you were outside, it would have been also very painful. And this is slowly but slowly, God is trying to diminish their gods, trying to reduce the impact of their power, to see something totally new and different. And this was a power that was unseen. It wasn't a statue, it wasn't a picture. They couldn't even see this God, but they had to feel the power of it. When we come to this portion, and the god is Seth, the god of storms and disorder. So I have a piece in the journal on table for 5 where they actually looked at this one sentence about the locusts. And I called it Grasshoppers Gone Amok, because they basically actually are like grasshoppers, but they proliferate, and then out of something that goes on, they get this serotonin, this hormone in their brain, and it forces them to literally just act and eat anything in sight. So they're being affected physically, and they've lost, the water and the animals, and now they have the grains being eaten up. You can imagine at this point the kind of fear that they were experiencing, because what they're feeling is that they're going to die, right? Everything that sustains them and nurtures them is dying, is destroyed. And here you see the image, a little bit of the head to refer to the locust. And after all of that, the sun god disappears. Ra, the sun god, was very important to the Egyptians. We know too, that for us, the sun and the new day is also very critical. In Judaism, the day begins at night in darkness. And we talked momentarily about the whole concept of darkness and light. The day begins in dark. The beauty of what happens in our tradition is that the morning comes and the darkness leaves, and it brings a sense of hope. And this is kind of a metaphor for our lives. There is darkness that comes, and then light replaces it. Something improves, something gets better. And for the Egyptians, this plague was critical. They could not see in front of them. That's how dark it was. That kind of darkness is horrific. If you go into a dark room, many of us can see a little bit. We can somehow find our way. But imagine a darkness where you couldn't even take a step because there was nothing there in front of you. And of course, the last one. And this one was Pharaoh himself. He was the ultimate power of Egypt. And the death of the firstborn in many ways was retribution for what they had done to the Israelite babies, correct? This was, in a way, getting, what goes around comes around. They received what they had given. And for Pharaoh himself, it appears in what we know that he may have been his only son, and so he was left with none of that. So, having seen that, are there any questions, ideas, and thoughts before we kind of move forward? Yes, Rebecca.
Eric made an interesting comment in the chat that
Yeah.
the locusts were also present when they were scouting the land. When the scouts came back, they mentioned locusts.
Oh, interesting. I've never really.
That's not me. That's Eric.
Yeah, for Eric. Yeah, I don't look at the chats because I find it distracting, honestly. That's interesting. They're going into the land was the place that they needed to take over. It may have been a message that they were going to get help from God to fight and take over, but that didn't help. I mean, the focus truly on what happens with the spies is their reaction to what they see and the messages they bring to the people. And therefore they can't stay there. They have to die eventually because they didn't have the courage. They didn't have the honesty. Is there anything else? So do you all see how the plagues were really critical in moving the people towards Sinai? It wasn't just getting them there. It was really breaking down the power and the confidence of the Egyptians and, getting Pharaoh to have a little bit of humility and say, oh, okay, maybe I'm not the most powerful person in the world. Maybe there is something greater. So let's look for a moment at this statement about the hardening of the heart. Ani Hichabadati et libo, I have hardened his heart. Now, in some of the statements of the hardening, the word kasheh is used, which means hard. But when you use the word kaved, the chaf bet daled, there's something particular that's being a message, right? That's being transmitted because we're talking about something that also means the liver. And it also means what? Honor, right? Kavod. We talk in Judaism about giving kavod to people. So if you wanted to reread that sentence, which is what I tried to do, it was as if God is saying, I will be honored by Pharaoh's heart. Right? It's just a little twist of turning the words around and understanding that when the word kaved is used here, it's trying to let us know that it's not just about being hard. So what does the liver do? Because it's also the word for the liver. It supports metabolism, immunity, digestion. In particular, it detoxifies. And in a way, what God is doing is a detoxification of the country, of the people. Does that make sense? That the word kaved is being used here for hardening because it's messaging something beyond just the hardness. I'm just looking at the time. I want to make sure we have time at the end. I have a number of names that I need to share. We need to do Kaddish. I want to do a prayer, but what we're talking about here is a man whose stubbornness became so much of a habit for him. It was so ingrained in him. Let me just, again, go back to some images and to talk about the heart. So we talked about the plagues, and there's the locusts. You can see not only are they doing damage, I'm sure the sound and the image must have been horrifying. And then, of course, that's the darkness, which you can barely see anything in front of you. And then the death of the firstborn. But here's something I wanted to share since you enjoy looking at the Hebrew. So the word Pharaoh in Hebrew, paro, if you break it up and switch the letters around, it can say peh, ra. Peh is a mouth and ra is evil. Tsar is difficulty and tightness and constriction, but ra is evil. And in a way, his name is indicating for us what? That there was an evilness that came from his mouth. The things that he said, the limitations that he put on the Israelites, and what he transmitted was basically evil. So you see that? The hay with the pet, and then Ra. So as I said, the first 5 plagues, Pharaoh kind of stiffens himself up. But in the last 5, it does say that God is the one that hardens the heart.
Excuse me,
Sure.
but doesn't the text say paro sometimes and pharaoh other times?
No, the Hebrew is basically paro. Paro is the way it is written in the Hebrew.
I thought it varied between paro and pharaoh.
Well, you know what? It does. That's probably more for grammar. The dot drops in the pay. If there's a letter before it, there are certain letters that if they're before a pay, the dot drops. Does that make sense? So
Okay.
sometimes it will be said paro. I can't scout it right now to find a pharaoh, but it will come up if there is a Hebrew letter in front of it that will change it. But that's grammatical. It's still the same word, believe it or not. So here we see the stubbornness of the man. And this is from Proverbs. He who hardens his heart shall fall into evil. So the sages remind us that when the heart becomes hard, when it becomes stiff, when you become stubborn, when you avoid and treat people maybe badly, you really fall into evil. And this is another image of paro, and the heart. And this image in a little way, it's trying to sort of image, if you can, the power of the Holy One hardening the heart. Psychologically, emotionally, some of the things that happen that indicate that our own hearts are being hardened. These are some of the things that we learn from psychologists, that if in fact we are cut off from our emotions, we can't cry, we can't experience joy, things become meaningless and mechanical. We don't have as much passion. We're more negative than positive. We become cynical. Sometimes we argue. That can happen as a result of the hardening of the heart. And it can make life difficult, right? You can see how hard life can become when the heart becomes solid and stiff. And sometimes our hearts are broken, right? And so they get a little harder as well. And so much of the story and what I try to do is find a way in for each person. Is what is the Torah trying to do to help us understand ourselves a little better? And sometimes we are enslaved and we need to break the chains and find a way to soften, which is the image of the heart, because it's such an important part of our being. It's not just that it keeps us alive and it pumps blood, but metaphorically, the heart in Judaism is about compassion, it's about chesed, it's about giving, it's about caring. And we're being reminded here of what happens when you're not humble, when you're not caring, when you're not giving, when you don't soften. Let me look at this. Hardening of the heart. Yeah. Yes, some of us have to watch our cholesterol. There is no question. And there is a reality to some of the things that happen physically. But what that means is we have to pay attention, right, to what we do and how we live. Some of it is inherited, but we have the capacity really to make choices about whether we exercise, whether we eat the right foods, whether we soften the heart so emotionally, we're not in a bad place and we're not angry because we know the mind body is connected, that some of what we feel affects our health and our body. Does that make sense? Anybody have some comments? Because it looks like pretty soon we're going to have to come to a close. Is there anything, someone like, yes, Brad?
Well, two things. Verse 24, there's Vayikra Pharaoh. But
Yes.
Anyway, the
Yes,
point that I wanted to make was, to me, you have to look at the story teleologically and looking from the end backwards. And the end of the story is liberation. And in order to have a good liberation story, you need to have a formidable enemy. And that's why Pharaoh is being propped up by God so that we can get to this glorious ending of a victory of one God over another supposed God.
absolutely.
So I think you can't look at any of this without looking at the ending. And the ending is a story of liberation.
Oh, absolutely. All of this is leading to one thing. And let me go back to number 24, because this is an example of what I was trying to teach you. Vayikra Pharaoh. You see the letter before Pharaoh is an aleph?
Yeah.
That softens the pay and the dot drops. When the dot drops, the letter becomes a pay instead of a pay. So I just want you to be alerted that when you read and see the aleph, the ayin, the vav, certain letters before these, the letters that have the dagesh in them, it will make the dagesh drop. But the word is still the same. He is still paro, even if we say pharaoh. But yes, absolutely, there is one goal here. And the goal is to move them towards Sinai to receive Torah. It's liberation for a purpose. And we'll talk about that more next week. Ray, you have a question.
I do, and I'm going to ask you to remind me, you were talking about a word that can be understood as hardened with the heart, but also as honored. I think it was kavod, something kavadur.
Yes, kavod.
Kavod.
Daled, yes.
I looked for that word in verse 27.
Okay.
I don't have much Hebrew knowledge, but I can manage letters and some meaning sometimes. And I'm not finding that word in verse 27 where it's we not. Do. Okay.
Yeah,
so what is
no, good,
stiffened?
good.
What is the word for stiffened there? And what
Chazak.
can we take from the different usage?
Chazak. This one is actually not hardened, but strengthened. Chazak means to be strong. So now we've gone from the hardening, the crusting, the stubbornness to making it hard. Hashem strengthened the heart of Pharaoh, and he did not wish to send them out. So again, going back to what Brad is saying, there is an ultimate reality that we're working towards, and God is now participating in not only hardening the heart, but strengthening it, getting him, he's becoming so, the image and the metaphor is, if you've ever been a little stubborn about something, sometimes we dig our heels in and we get even more stubborn the more somebody else argues with us. We can't let go. And that's what's happening to Pharaoh here. He's stiffening up. He is so angry and hard, and it's making him stronger in his belief. So we're getting to the point where he's going to pay the ultimate price. right? Because the chazak, the strengthening now is going to lead to the loss of his beloved son. If you don't bend, you break, right? That's a very important thing to be aware of and understand. If you don't bend, you break. Pharaoh is not bending. In the beginning, he was just, he didn't want to let them go. He needed them. But as time went on, he dug his heels in, he got more stubborn, and God decided, you know what? You didn't heed any of the warnings. I'm going to make it worse and worse and worse to the point where you're going to break. And with the death of his son, what happens? He finally breaks.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And anything else? Because I have a number of pages here that I've been given that I see as an important part of the ending. I guess what I like to leave you with is just the thought for yourself of what does it mean in your lives when your heart hardens or breaks or gets a little bit stubborn, loses the humility and the softness and the compassion. And what we need is soft hearts, right? We need to be loving. We need to be caring. Yes, Howard. I'm sorry, you have to unmute.
Sorry. If I may be wrong about this, but it seems like the word that's translated hardened really means heavy, make heavy.
Yes.
And why does it always almost always translated as hardened when actually it means make heavy or liver?
That's a good question. You know, the problem with translation is its interpretation. Because sometimes if you look at a different chumash, you'll find something different. There are newer Bibles out that actually do what you're talking about. They look at the word in its true meaning because it does mean heaviness. And there is a heaviness, of course, that is within the heart and within the soul of Egypt right now, with all that they've gone through, right? It's heavy. And I think the idea of the hardening is something that maybe people just relate to better, that they can understand better. But truly, you're pointing out what's accurate, that it is heavy. Yes.
Do you favor going back to
the original
meaning of the words, or do you like to make it mean what you want it to mean? Well, make it a riff like jazz.
It is like a riff. That's really good. I think that all those words, maybe interchangeable, are important because we need to think of it in multiple ways. It is hard, it is heavy, it is stiff, it is stubborn. Perhaps, because it comes up to 5 times, he does it to himself. But 5 times God does it to him. So it's very possible that we could interchange these words so that we have a different nuance, right? Each time that it's used. Here you see it's chazak, right? So
they're both translated stiffened, though. That one was translated stiffened, but actually means strengthened.
Yeah, it's chazak is strong. Yeah, so I thank you for that. I think if you look at some other Bibles, you might actually see, I'll have to check and I'll tell you next week. I have 2 very modern interpretations, whether they do use the word heavy, because, and then the idea of, as I said, of God being honored through Pharaoh and through these plagues. God is lifted up in a way above while the Egyptian gods are being brought low. So with that, I really need to shift to the end because I want to do my due diligence here. We've got the Kaddish list here, and we also have those who passed away during the month. So let me mention their names. Nancy Bell, Alice Berkowitz, Robert Brand, Hamlin Emery, Jerry Feisenthal, Louis Joseph Hassan, Sila Horn, Daniel Elkin Levin, Norman Malin, George Nagler, Herbert Rettinger, Sander Romick, Adrian Rosenbaum Jacobson, Robert Bob Ra, Arlene Salkin, Richard Sires, Hal Slan, Ralph Julius Stern, Ruth Stock, Bradley Eric Sugar. Maybe that was Stock. That was the Hebrew would be Stock. Philip Sunshine and Diane Thome. Yortzites that are occurring this past week. There's quite a few names here. Some of you may know them. Ronald Arthur Allen, Rose Baker, Faye Beecher, Minu Sahati Berliani, Eliani Beryl Fain, Paul Bornstein, Melvin Braveman, Deborah Bronner, Bernard Brown, Earl Buber, Richard Shannon, Fortune Levy Cohen, Rhoda Dane, Bella Schimmel-Desser, Jane Deverell, Sidney Fell, Jack Fellman, Sarah Fischler, Stanley Fisher, Meredith Elaine Fishman, Carl Freudenthal, Irv Gassner. And given, I think I need to end in 2 minutes. Does anybody actually have a yard site this week? Are you remembering anybody had a loss?
Susan Abrams Tiano.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Because the time is short, I don't know if I'm allowed to go over or not, honestly.
Usually goes over.
Can we go over?
That's what seems to be very common for the
Yeah, we've gone over in a modest way, a few minutes here and there.
Okay.
I don't think anyone.
Okay. Because I want to do exactly what is asked. Alice Skittleson, Anne Glantz-Rock, William Gallant, Naomi Suggs-Goldberg, Eva Golden, Stephen Goldinger, Samuel Goodman, Sarah Gordon, David Gross, Gary Gross, Sadia Gruskin, Maluk Halimi, Samuel Warner Halper, Henry Hartman, Margareta Heald, Robert Henningsen, Josephine Hertz, Warner Hirsch, Frank Hoffer, Carol Janowski, Marvin Kalin, Robert Karatz, Olive Kotz, Debbie Kaufman, Melvin Kamach, Natalie Kaiser, Shirley Kirschner, Paula Klein, Frank Cohn, Daniel Corral, Bernard Krakow, Stanley Kubidlowski, Chaim Kurtzman, Arthur Levin, Shirley Londy, Lester Lotz, Alvin Malkin, Diane Mandel Miller, Victor Marshall, Anita Marston, Etta Mellinger, Ellen Miller, Marvin Morris, Naomi Moyer, Fanny Nagler, Frank Naiman, Russell Norkin, Joyce Oler, Stacy Perisser, Pia Persoff, Francine Peterman, Monroe Feltzer, Ed Raskin, Nate Rosenberg, Ruth Rosenberg, Gail Retro Rosenthal, Joseph Rosner, Mona Ross, William Rubin, Eleonora Subshikova, Marlene Sauer, Morris Saban, Mark Schmidt, Peter Schoenberger, Mark Steven Schwartz, Miriam Ruth Schweitzer, Rose Siegel, Ben Siegel, Lillian Sinitsky, David Siegel, Patricia Silver, Larry Slayton, Lena Small, Rosella Smith, Leon Julius Steinsapir, Susan Hattie Steinsapir, Gary Stern, Leonid Stolyarski, Clarice Strauss, Susan Tiano, Shirley Barash, Baron, Margot Vietor, Hyman Rager, Ida Weissman, Julius Weinstein, Hiraj Eliyahu, Yedid Sion, Gay Sugarman, Young. And we had one addition that you acknowledged. We want to remember those who have died fighting the wars in Israel. And we are going to say Kaddish together. Yitgadal v'yikadash shemei Rabba. V'alma divrach yirutei v'yamlik malchutei. V'chayechon v'yomechon v'chayei dechol be'Yisrael ba'agala v'zman kariv v'imru Amen. Yehei shmei Rabba mevorach le'olam u'lomei amaya. Yibarak, v'yishtabach, v'yipa'ar, v'yitromam, v'yitnaseh, v'yitadar, v'yitalev, v'yitalal, shemedu kudashah, brihu, le'ela, min kol berchata v'shirata, tush bechata v'nechemata, dam miram b'yamav v'imru, amen. Yehi shlomo rabba min shemaya, v'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru, amen. Oseh shalom b'mramav, hu ya'aseh shalom. Aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'al kol yoshvei tevel v'imru.
Amen.
Amen. Is there anybody want to share anything before we do a Mishabera?
Thank you very much for this class, Rabbi. I've taken another class with you when you've substituted for Rabbi Nanas in the past, so I'm looking forward to the next 3 Sundays. Thank you.
Yeah, you looked familiar, Rebecca. Thank you for being there and being my shill. You got me right to the thing we needed to talk about. So these are people who are not well, and I ask you to hold in your hearts, speaking of hearts, anybody, yourself included, family, friends, there are many suffering. Let's acknowledge that there are many in this world that are suffering. But in the community, Michael Alkoff, Bonnie Chizek, Megan Cotunio, Chaim David, Harina Wellen Harar, Cindy Jacobson, Marvin Levy, Chuck Polip, Quincy Rose, Judith Salter, Nancy Center, Ansel Sloan, and Shraga Stern. And you know that you can find, of course, all the events at your website. But let's do one last thing, a prayer for the captives. We still have people whose hearts, I can imagine, must be very heavy, right? Very heavy. Our God, be a refuge for the oppressed, a refuge in times of trouble. Send complete rescue and full redemption to those who are held captive by the enemy. Strengthen their spirit, bring them our prayers, that they may be protected from all harm. Implant understanding in the heart of the enemy, that they may return the captives in the wholeness of body and spirit. Grant wisdom to the Israel Defense Forces, that they may secure freedom for the captives without loss of life. Grant strength of spirit, courage of heart. There's another word. Courage of heart to all the sons and daughters of Abraham and Sarah, to release bonds of captivity and allow us to live in freedom. They shall call upon me, and I will answer them. I will be with them in distress. I will rescue them and honor them. From Psalm 91, Kavod. And we say, Amen. Have a wonderful Shabbat, and I will see you next week.
Shabbat shalom. Thank you.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom, everybody.